The small fingers of 7-year-old Minjai Park were trembling as she fumbled with the cracked screen of an old, encrypted burner phone. Her mother was at her night-cleaning job, and the monster, Junho, the butcher Lim, had finally done the unthinkable. All she wanted was to send a desperate plea for her mother to come save her from the man who had just shattered the quiet safety of their Koreatown apartment. In her panicked haste, her small thumb slipped, missing a single digit, and the text meant for a mother's comfort landed in the hands of the most feared syndicate leader in New York. Kang-di, the Iron Wolf, was closing out a cold transaction with his deadliest enforcers when his phone beeped. Normally, he would have ignored the distraction, but he was waiting for a signal he'd been chasing for a decade. As he read the 4 words, "Mom, he broke my arm," his expression didn't just darken, it turned into stone. He recognized the unique ghosted encryption of the sender, a noble signature of the family he once served. Without a word, he signaled his boys to track the signal and prepare to arrive at the location within 10 minutes. Minjai Park's arm was broken. She knew it because of the sickening snap she'd heard when Junho twisted her small frame in a rage fueled by greed and a lack of old-world honor. The pain was a white-hot scream behind her eyes, but worse than the fracture was the realization that the invisible wall her mother, Hana, had built to protect them had finally crumbled. For 10 years, Hana the ghost, Park had been trapped in a nightmare of her own making, hiding her scholar princess, brilliance behind submissive bows and night-cleaning shifts to avoid the ghosts of the Night of Ash. She was a woman who believed paralysis by fear was the only way to keep her daughter alive. But as Minjai huddled in the corner of their cramped apartment, watching a man who extorted them for pennies transform into a butcher who broke children, she realized tonight was different. The ghost hadn't just been found. The Iron Wolf was coming home. The morning sun crept over the rolling hills of the Hudson Valley, but for Hana Park, the light was merely a spotlight she spent every waking hour trying to avoid. In the cramped, shadow-filled apartment she shared with 7-year-old Minjai, the air always felt thin, as if the walls themselves were closing in to help her hide. At 33, Hana had become a master of the background, a shadow that moved with the practiced, rhythmic grace of someone who didn't want to be caught. She spent her days as a translator, her voice a soft, unremarkable whisper that never betrayed the brilliant strategist hidden beneath her tired eyes. By night, she became a cleaner, scrubbing the marble floors of high-rise offices until her hands were raw, her mind constantly counting the exits and identifying the blind spots of every room she entered. This grueling double life was a fortress of silence she had built to protect her daughter from a world that had once burned her to ash. As she folded Minjai's small clothes, the smell of the laundry detergent, cheap and antiseptic, hit her, and for a fleeting second, it transformed into the scent of burning cedar and expensive tobacco. 10 years vanished. She was no longer in New York. She was 23 again, huddled in a crawlspace in Seoul, watching through a vent as her father's library was consumed by the Night of Ash. She remembered the cold weight of the silver ring he had pressed into her palm, commanding her to survive by being nobody. She adjusted her oversized, clear-lens glasses, a signature accessory that acted as a filter, dulling the intensity of a gaze that was far too sharp for a simple cleaner. Behind those frames, Hana's eyes were the eyes of a scholar princess, trained to identify a concealed weapon by the slight sag of a suit jacket or a traitor by the rhythm of his breathing. But in this life, those eyes were a liability. Meal, her father had called her, honey, for a sweetness she had long ago buried under layers of submissive bows and stuttered apologies. She lived in a constant state of internal friction, the brilliance of her strategic training warring with the survivor's guilt that demanded she stay small. To be noticed was to be hunted. To be brilliant was to be a target. As she prepared for her shift, Hana tightened her apron and lowered her chin, burying the princess deep beneath the mask of the woman in the shadows, unaware that the silence she worked so hard to maintain was about to be shattered by a single, desperate mistake. The heavy, uneven thud of a boot against the apartment door signaled the end of the day's fragile peace. Hana wasn't home yet. She was still scrubbing the floors of a midtown skyscraper, leaving 7-year-old Minjai alone with the shadows and a growing sense of dread. The locks groaned under the pressure of a master key, and the door swung open to reveal the hulking, sharp-edged silhouette of Junho, the butcher Lim. He didn't look like a debt collector. He looked like a man who enjoyed the weight of a blade in his hand. "Where is she, little bird?" Junho rasped, his voice a low vibration that made the glass of water on the small table tremble. He stepped into the cramped living room, the smell of cheap cigarettes and cold rain clinging to his leather jacket. He was a mid-level predator who fed on the weak, completely unaware that the woman he was extorting carried the blood of the most feared strategists in Seoul. To him, Hana was just a broken cleaner who was 3 days late on her protection tax. Minjai retreated toward the kitchen counter, her small hands trembling. My mommy is working. She'll have the money tomorrow, please." Junho's eyes narrowed, the jagged scar through his eyebrow twitching. He hated the word tomorrow. It was the sound of a lion losing its meal. "Tomorrow doesn't pay for my time today," he hissed. He reached out, his massive hand closing around Minjai's slender forearm. He didn't mean to break her. He simply wanted to leave a mark that would ensure Hana never missed a payment again. But in his cruel, careless strength, he twisted. The snap was sickeningly loud in the quiet apartment, a dry, hollow sound like a branch breaking in winter. Minjai let out a strangled, high-pitched scream before collapsing to the floor, her arm hanging at an unnatural, agonizing angle. The butcher let go, his face momentarily flashing with the realization that he had overstepped, but his empathy was a dead thing. He spat on the floor and walked out, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. Blinded by white-hot pain and gasping for breath, Minjai crawled toward the sofa where Hana kept her emergency burner phone, the old, encrypted device from the Night of Ash that she was never supposed to touch. With tears streaming down her face and her vision blurring, Minjai fumbled with the keypad. She tried to type the number Hana had made her memorize, but her shaking fingers slipped. She hit a 9 instead of an 8, missing the final digit of her mother's burner. The text went through instantly. "Mom, he broke my arm. Please come." She didn't know the message had bypassed the Queen's cellular towers and bypassed the translator's phone entirely. Instead, it traveled through a ghosted relay, landing directly on the obsidian-black smartphone of the Iron Wolf, miles away in a high-rise fortress. The signal was out. The ghost had finally spoken. The stillness of the Koreatown street was shattered not by a siren, but by the synchronized roar of 5 obsidian-black SUVs. They didn't just drive. They occupied, swerving with predatory precision to block the intersections, their tires screeching against the asphalt like a declaration of war. Pedestrians scattered as the doors flew open in perfect unison, and a dozen men in razor-sharp suits emerged, their hands already inside their jackets. At the center of the storm was Kangdi, the Iron Wolf. Oh, he stepped onto the pavement, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to drop the temperature of the evening air. His eyes, cold and fixed, were locked on the crumbling facade of the apartment building. He didn't look like a man responding to a wrong number. He looked like a god of vengeance reclaiming a lost temple. Inside the apartment, the nightmare hadn't ended. Junho the butcher Lim had turned back at the threshold, his eyes landing on the old burner phone clutched in Minjai's good hand. Fear of discovery overrode his cowardice. "Who were you calling, brat?" he snarled, his heavy boots thumping back across the hardwood. He loomed over the sobbing child, his hand raised to strike again, to snatch away the evidence of his brutality. The front door didn't just open, it disintegrated. The wood splintered under the force of a single, calculated kick, the frame groaning as it yielded. Junho spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the serrated blade tucked into his waistband, but he froze. Kangdi stood in the doorway, framed by the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. He moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, entering the small living room as if he owned every atom of the space. He didn't look at the butcher. His gaze dropped to Minjai, huddled on the floor, her small face pale with agony and her arm cradled against her chest. "The text said, 'Mom,'" Kangdi said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the promise of an open grave. He stepped closer, the polished leather of his shoes clicking softly on the floorboards. "But the signature on that phone belongs to a man who died 10 years ago, a man I owed everything to." Junho's bravado vanished. He recognized the Iron Wolf symbol on the man's lapel pin, the mark of the syndicate that ran the city from the shadows. I didn't know, Junho stammered, his knees beginning to buckle. She's just a cleaner's kid. It was just a lesson. Kangdi finally turned his eyes toward the butcher. It wasn't a look of anger. It was the look of a scientist observing an insect before crushing it. A lesson, Kangdi whispered, stepping into the butcher's personal space until the taller man had to lean back. Then let me teach you one in return. In the old world, we don't break children. We break the men who touch them. The heavy silence of the apartment was broken only by the sound of sirens in the distance, and the soft, hitching breaths of Minjai as Kangdi's private medic tended to her arm. Hana stood in the center of the small living room, her posture hunched, her hands buried deep in her apron pockets. She had arrived home to find her front door splintered, and the hallway filled with men who looked like the very nightmares she had fled 10 years ago. Kangdi watched her, his sharp gaze cutting through the oversized clear-lens glasses she wore like armor. He stepped away from the window, the city lights behind him casting his silhouette in a jagged, intimidating outline. You've spent 10 years pretending to be a ghost, Hana, he said, his voice low and vibrating with a strange, dark reverence. But the encryption on that phone, it's a signature. Your father's signature. He saved my life during the purge in Seoul. He hid me in the vents of the library while the rest of the world burned. I owe the park name a debt that blood can never fully repay. Hana flinched, her eyes darting to the floor. She felt the scholar princess screaming to emerge from beneath her skin, to stand tall and speak the language of kings, but the terror of the Night of Ash was a physical weight. I don't know what you're talking about, sir, she whispered, her voice trembling with a practiced, submissive stutter. I'm just a cleaner, that phone. It was something I found in a thrift shop. Please, you've saved my daughter and we are grateful, but we just want to be left alone. Kangdi took a step closer, his polished shoes clicking on the hardwood. He reached out, his fingers stopping just short of touching her chin. He didn't see a stuttering cleaner. He saw the daughter of the greatest strategist the Underworld had ever known. The man who did this to your daughter is currently being held in the basement of my estate, he said, his eyes searching hers for a spark of the old fire. I didn't come here to offer charity, Hana. I came because the Iron Wolf does not forget his protectors. The world thinks the parks are ash. Tell me I'm wrong. You're wrong, Hana lied, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. She clutched her elbows, refusing to look up. To acknowledge him was to acknowledge the war she had left behind. She knew that the moment she stepped back into that world, she would no longer be a mother, she would be a target. We are nobodies, we are ghosts, please, just go. Kangdi's expression didn't shift, but a cold, lethal resolve settled in his eyes. He knew she was lying. He also knew that the butcher's attack was just the beginning. The signal had been sent, and whether Hana wanted it or not, the shadows were no longer safe. I will leave, he murmured, but my men will remain at your door. You can pretend to be a ghost all you want, Hana Park, but even ghosts need a fortress when the vultures start circling. The sanctuary of the high-rise safe house felt more like a gilded cage as the elevator doors slid open with a predatory hiss. Hana stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her fingers twitching against the hem of her oversized sweater, watching the city lights blur through the lenses of her glasses. She wasn't alone. Kangdi stood near the door, but the atmosphere had sharpened into a blade, with the arrival of the woman now stalking across the plush carpet. Jaisu, the ice viper, didn't walk. She glided, her sharp bob and tailored white suit radiating a cold, clinical hostility. As the syndicate's financial architect, she saw the world in ledgers and liabilities, and to her, Hana Park was a glaring deficit. She ignored her brother, her gaze locking onto Hana with the intensity of a scalpel. A cleaner from Queens with the signature of a dead king, Jaisu drawled, her voice like cracking ice. She tossed a thick leather folder onto the glass coffee table. My brother is a romantic, Hana. He sees a debt of honor. I see a girl who found a burner phone in the trash and is looking for a payday. Hana maintained her slump, her chin tucked low. I don't want any money, ma'am. I just want my daughter to be safe. Then you won't mind helping me with a small discrepancy, Jaisu countered, a lethal smile touching her lips. She opened the folder to a series of complex, scrambled offshore wire transfers, a triple-layered shell company maze used by their rivals to hide a recent heist. These accounts were frozen by an old Vitali-style cipher. If you are truly the daughter of the scholar Dawn, you'll see the pattern. If not, you're a fraud, and my brother's protection ends tonight." Hana looked at the screen. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The cipher was a leaning willow sequence, her father's favorite. It was designed to look like a random error to anyone without his specific training. Jaisu had intentionally altered 3 of the nodes to create a logic loop that would trigger a silent alarm if touched incorrectly. It wasn't just a test. It was a trap designed to get Hana killed or arrested. For a moment, the silence in the room was absolute. Hana felt the weight of Minjai sleeping in the next room. She looked at the botched code and felt a surge of cold, academic insult. To leave the error as it was felt like an affront to her father's memory. I don't understand these numbers," Hana whispered, her voice trembling. But as she leaned closer, pretending to squint, her finger accidentally brushed the screen, swiping 3 times in a recursive arc. She didn't solve the puzzle. She bypassed the alarm nodes entirely and rerouted the entire ledger into a dormant recovery fund. Jaisu's breath hitched as the screen turned from a warning red to a neutral, hollow gray. The trap had vanished, not through a solution, but through a deletion. "The screen. It went dark," Hana said, shrinking back as if afraid she'd broken it. Jaisu stared at the monitor, her composure fracturing. She knew exactly what had happened. No amateur could have found the alarm nodes, let alone neutralized them with a single gesture. The ice viper looked at the stuttering cleaner and saw, for the first time, the shadow of a woman who could dismantle her entire world without ever raising her voice. The safe house was supposed to be a fortress, but to Hana's trained eyes, the sudden silence of the hallway was a siren. She was tucked in the shadows of the kitchenette when she saw the security feed on the wall flicker, a deliberate millisecond loop that only someone who had built such systems would recognize. Panic, sharp and cold, flared in her chest as she realized the ice viper's security had been compromised. This wasn't a glitch, it was a breach. Before she could reach the bedroom where Minjai lay sleeping, the balcony glass shattered. 3 men in tactical gear swarmed inside, their movements synchronized and lethal. Jaisu, caught off guard in the main parlor, reached for her sidearm, but she was too slow. One of the intruders leveled a suppressed submachine gun at her chest, while the other 2 moved with terrifying purpose toward the child's room. In that heartbeat, the cleaner died. Hana didn't scream. She didn't stutter. She stepped out of the kitchen shadows, her posture shifting into a terrifyingly straight line of noble authority. "Stop!" she commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the resonant, bone-chilling weight of the scholar Dawn. The men hesitated, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer, unexpected command in her tone. She didn't wait for them to recover. Using the momentum of their confusion, Hana snatched a heavy decorative decanter from the sideboard and hurled it with mathematical precision, not at the men, but at the overhead chandelier's main junction box. The room plunged into absolute darkness just as she lunged. While Jaisu scrambled in the dark, Hana moved with the Night of Ash clarity. She didn't fight like a brawler. She moved like a ghost through a maze she had already solved. She used the attacker's own night vision goggles against them, clicking on a high-intensity floor lamp for a fraction of a second to blind them before sliding across the marble. She swept the lead intruder's legs and used his falling weight to disarm the second man, all while positioning herself as a human shield in front of Minjai's door. When the backup generators kicked in and the lights flickered back to life, the 3 intruders were on the floor, disarmed and groaning, their tactical formation dismantled by a woman who looked like a queen standing amidst a battlefield. Jaisu stood frozen, her pistol shaking in her hand as she looked at Hana. The stuttering cleaner was gone. Hana stood with her chin tilted high, her oversized glasses discarded on the floor, her eyes burning with a brilliance that made the ice viper look like a novice. "You focused on the perimeter sensors, Jaisu," Hana said, her voice cool and clinical, devoid of any fear. "But you forgot that the service elevator's hydraulic pressure drops before a manual override. You were looking for a wolf at the door while the vultures were already in the vents." Jaisu lowered her gun, her face pale. She realized then that she hadn't just been outfought, she had been intellectually dismantled. The scholar princess hadn't just returned, she had taken command. The transition from the safe house to Kangdi's primary stronghold felt like a journey into the heart of a sleeping beast. The estate was a monolith of cold basalt and reinforced glass, hidden deep within the wooded outskirts of the city, protected by layers of biometric scanners and men who moved with the silent efficiency of ghosts. As the heavy iron gates hissed shut behind them, Hana felt the familiar, suffocating weight of a fortress. To the world, this was the safest place on Earth. To her, it was a reminder that once you entered the lion's den, you were either the pride or the prey. Inside, the air was filtered and sterile, smelling of ozone and expensive cologne. Kangdi walked beside her, his hand hovering near the small of her back, not quite touching, but acting as a constant, protective shadow. Minjai was already being settled into a suite filled with toys and soft silks, but Hana couldn't relax. Her scholar princess instincts were screaming, vibrating against her skin like a live wire. She stood in the center of the grand command room, her eyes scanning the wall of monitors. Kangdi's lieutenants were busy, their fingers flying over keyboards. But Hana wasn't looking at the data. She was looking at the people. She watched the way a junior enforcer avoided Kangdi's gaze, the way the ventilation hummed slightly out of sync, and the way the internal security logs showed a series of phantom logins from a terminal in the north wing that should have been vacant. "The Iron Wolf is surrounded by mirrors," Hana whispered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical whir of the room. Kangdi turned to her, his brow furrowed. "The perimeter is impenetrable, Hana. My men are vetted through blood." "Blood can be bought," she countered, her eyes fixing on a subtle discrepancy in the guard rotation displayed on the screen. "Look at the shift change for the armory. It's 4 seconds early, every night for a week. Someone isn't just watching you, Kangdi, they are synchronized with you." She moved to the main console, her fingers dancing over the keys with a speed that made the room's head technician gasp. She didn't look for a hack, she looked for a hollow. She found it buried in the subcode of the fortress's primary life support system, a backdoor that allowed for a remote override of the oxygen scrubbers. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The traitor wasn't just planning an assassination, they were planning a mass execution. Hana's gaze shifted to the far corner of the room, where a senior advisor was slowly reaching for a localized jammer. The mask of the stuttering cleaner was long gone. In its place was the cold, lethal clarity of the park lineage. She had found the leak, but as the advisor's eyes met hers, she knew the Night of Ash was no longer a memory. It was beginning all over again, right here in the heart of the Iron Wolf's den. The advisor's hand never reached the jammer. Before he could close his fingers around the device, Kangdi's silencer coughed twice, a dry sound that signaled the absolute end of the traitor's influence. The body fell, but Hana didn't flinch. She was already leaning over the main console, her mind operating on a level of cold, geometric precision that made the high-tech room feel primitive. She knew the butcher and his financiers from Seoul were waiting for a signal of weakness, a flicker in the fortress's shielding, and she was going to give it to them. "They want a ghost," Hana said, her voice dropping into the resonant, authoritative tone of the scholar princess. "So we will give them a haunting." With a few keystrokes, she didn't just lock the gates, she opened them. She created a digital mirage, a false loop in the security feed that made the East Wing appear vulnerable while secretly routing the entire defense grid into a funnel. She was using a classic park strategy, the empty mountain. You show the enemy the path to the treasure, but you make the path the trap itself. Junho, the butcher, Lim arrived with the arrogance of a man who thought he had bought the keys to the kingdom. He led a team of elite Seoul mercenaries through the unlocked service entrance, his serrated blade gleaming under the dim red emergency lights Hana had triggered to simulate a power failure. He thought he was hunting a terrified cleaner and a distracted Dawn. He didn't realize he was walking into a kill zone designed by the finest tactical mind of the previous generation. As the butcher reached the central courtyard, the false silence shattered. Hana didn't use a frontal assault, she used the environment. She triggered the high-pressure fire suppression systems, blinding the mercenaries with a wall of chemical fog. In the confusion, Kangdi and his iron wolves emerged like shadows from the mist. The sound of the engagement was short, brutal and one-sided. Hana watched from the command center, her eyes fixed on the heat signatures on the screen. When the butcher was finally cornered, his blade useless against the heavy caliber muzzles leveled at his chest, Kangdi didn't pull the trigger. He looked up at the camera, waiting. Hana pressed the intercom, her voice echoing through the courtyard with the weight of 10 years of suppressed fury. "Junho," she whispered, and for the first time, the butcher heard the voice of the woman he had tried to break. In the old world, the strategist doesn't just win the war, they erase the enemy. She tapped a final sequence, locking the courtyard's thermal-insulated doors. The benefactors in Seoul watched their screens go black as she executed a permanent wipe of their financial nodes, leaving them bankrupt and exposed. The butcher looked up, realizing too late that he hadn't been fighting a mafia boss. He had been fighting a legend who had finally decided to stop hiding. The Iron Wolf moved in to finish the debt, and in the silence that followed, the ghost felt the heavy weight of her fear dissolve into the cold, sharp air of victory. The heavy, iron-scented air of the stronghold had shifted. The dust of the confrontation had settled, but in its wake stood a woman the world no longer recognized. Hana stood in the center of the Grand Council chamber, the early morning light cutting through the high windows and illuminating the path she had once fled. The oversized, clear-lens glasses, the mask that had allowed her to hide as a nobody for a decade, lay shattered on the floor of the command center, discarded like the skin of a creature that had outgrown its cage. Kangdi watched her from the head of the long obsidian table, his expression one of dark, reverent satisfaction. His lieutenants, men who had once looked at the stuttering cleaner with dismissive pity, now stood at rigid attention, their eyes lowered in a gesture of instinctive respect. They weren't looking at a waitress or a victim, they were looking at the last living legacy of the Park bloodline. Hana's posture was no longer hunched. She stood with a razor-straight spine, her chin tilted at the regal angle of a woman born to rule from the shadows. Without the dulling filter of her lenses, her eyes were terrifyingly sharp, burning with the scholar princess, brilliance that had once made her father the most feared man in Seoul. She moved to the head of the table, her fingers trailing over the holographic display of the syndicate's global operations. "The old world is dead," Hana said, her voice resonant and cool, carrying the weight of a queen reclaiming her throne. "The butcher was a symptom of a larger rot. You have the muscle, Kangdi, but you lack the architecture of the new age. From this moment on, we don't just react to the shadows, we command them." She began to swipe through the data, her movements fluid and authoritative. She wasn't just organizing a mafia, she was redesigning an empire, replacing brute force with the sophisticated, multi-layered strategies of the scholar Dawn. She looked at Minjai, who was watching from the doorway with wide, curious eyes, no longer a child of a ghost, but the heir to a dynasty. Kangdi stepped forward, offering his hand not as a protector, but as a peer. "The Iron Wolf has found its mind," he murmured. Hana didn't take his hand to be led. She gripped it to seal a pact. The Night of Ash had failed. The fire hadn't consumed her. It had tempered her. As she turned her gaze back to the city's skyline, the ghost was truly gone. In her place was a strategist who would ensure that no one would ever dare break a child of her lineage again. The scholar princess had come home, and the underworld would never be the same.